August 18th, 1590, Roanoke Island. On the morning of August 18th, 1590, a small group of English sailors approached the northern end of Roanoke Island. Among them was Governor John White. For almost 3 years, White had been trying to return to this place. 3 years earlier, he had sailed away from Roanoke, leaving behind a settlement of English men, women, and children. Among them were his own daughter, Eleanor Dare, his son-in-law, Ananias Dare, and his granddaughter, Virginia Dare. Virginia had been born on this island on August 18th, 1587. Now, exactly 3 years later, her grandfather was returning. White had every reason to expect that somewhere beyond the trees he would find his family. Perhaps they would come running toward him. Perhaps he would see houses, smoke from cooking fires, fields under cultivation, children playing near the settlement. Instead, he found silence. As White's party moved toward the old colony, they discovered letters carved into a tree. 3 letters. CRO. They continued toward the settlement. What White remembered as a collection of houses had changed. The colonists had constructed a defensive palisade around the area. But there were no colonists, no families, no children, no soldiers waiting to greet him. Then carved into one of the wooden posts was a longer word. Croatoan. It would become one of the most famous clues in American history. Yet to John White, it was not necessarily frightening. Before he had left Roanoke in 1587, White and the colonists had agreed on a system. If they moved, they were to carve the name of their new destination. If they were forced away under serious danger, they were supposed to add a particular cross as a distress signal. White saw no such cross. And Croatoan was not an unknown word. Croatoan was the name of an indigenous community, friendly to the English, at various points in the Roanoke story. It was also the name used for an island to the south, associated with modern Hatteras Island. Manteo, one of the most important indigenous intermediaries in the English expeditions, was Croatoan. White therefore had an immediate explanation. Perhaps his family was still alive. Perhaps the settlers had simply moved. He wanted to sail south and investigate. But before that mystery could be solved, the weather turned against him. The expedition had already suffered dangerous seas and losses. Anchors had been lost. Sailors were unwilling to risk their ships further. The search for Croatoan could not be completed. John White would leave the coast without finding his daughter, without finding his granddaughter, without finding any of the colonists, and he would never return. What happened during those missing 3 years? To understand that, we must go back before the colony disappeared, because Roanoke's mystery did not begin when the people vanished. It began with the dangerous ambitions that brought them there. Hashka, Part 2. England wanted a new world empire. England, early 1580s. In the late 16th century, England was entering a dangerous competition for power. Spain possessed an enormous overseas empire. Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying valuable cargo from territories in the Americas. For ambitious Englishmen, the Atlantic represented opportunity, trade, territory, privateering, and potentially enormous wealth. One of the men drawn to this vision was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was close to Queen Elizabeth I and became a central sponsor of English colonization efforts in North America. The English used the name Virginia. For a vast and poorly defined territory along the Atlantic coast, their goal was not simply to explore it. They wanted a permanent English presence. Such a settlement could give England access to resources, expand trade, strengthen its claim to North American territory, and potentially provide a base from which English privateers could threaten Spanish shipping. But maps of the region were incomplete. European knowledge of the coastline was limited, and the land was not empty. Indigenous nations and communities had lived across the region for generations. English survival would therefore depend not only on ships and supplies, but on relationships with people who already knew the land, waterways, climate, crops, and seasons. In 1584, an English reconnaissance voyage reached the region. Among the indigenous men who eventually traveled to England were Manteo and One Cheese. Their experiences would take very different directions. Manteo developed an unusually close relationship with the English and later became a crucial interpreter and intermediary. The information gathered during these expeditions encouraged Raleigh to support another attempt. In 1585, England sent a colony to Roanoke Island, but this was not yet the family settlement that would become the famous Lost Colony. The 1585 expedition had a strongly military character. Its members included soldiers, specialists, explorers, and men tasked with gathering information about the region. Among those associated with these early Roanoke voyages was John White, an artist and mapmaker whose surviving watercolors preserve extraordinary visual records of indigenous communities, plants, animals, and landscapes encountered by the English. Another was Thomas Harriot, a scholar who studied the region and its languages. The English were collecting knowledge, but knowledge did not guarantee wisdom. Relations between the newcomers and local indigenous communities soon deteriorated, and the consequences of those early conflicts would still be waiting when John White's families arrived 2 years later. Roanoke was already becoming dangerous before Virginia Dare was ever born. Haskag, Part 3. The Colony Before the Lost Colony. Roanoke Region, 1585 to 1586. The settlement established in 1585 was led by Ralph Lane. At first, English exploration produced valuable geographical information. The colonists traveled through waterways and visited indigenous settlements. But the English depended heavily on local food. That dependence became increasingly dangerous as relationships deteriorated. The newcomers did not fully understand the political alliances and rivalries among the different communities around them, nor did every indigenous group see the English in the same way. Some individuals cooperated, some traded, some resisted. Some relationships changed over time. Reducing all of these communities to a single reaction would distort what happened. What is clear is that distrust increased. Violence followed. The Lane colony eventually abandoned Roanoke in 1586. Many colonists sailed home with Sir Francis Drake, but the English had not abandoned Raleigh's larger dream. Later, Sir Richard Grenville arrived and found the settlement deserted. He left a small group, traditionally recorded as 15 men, to maintain England's claim. Those 15 men were isolated. When the next major English expedition arrived in 1587, the settlers expected to find them. Instead, They found evidence that something had gone badly wrong. The fate of those men would become a warning. But the new settlers had crossed an ocean. They included families. They had invested their futures in this expedition. Turning around would not be simple. The stage was now set for Raleigh's next attempt. And this time, England was not sending merely a temporary military outpost. This time, women would come. Children would come. Families would attempt to build homes. This was supposed to be different. The new settlement even had a planned destination different from Roanoke. They intended to establish themselves farther north, in the Chesapeake Bay region. Roanoke was supposed to be a stop along the way. That single fact is crucial to understanding everything that followed, because the settlers who would disappear were never originally supposed to build their permanent colony on Roanoke Island at all. Hasgag, Part 4, 117. People cross the Atlantic. April 1587. John White was selected as governor of the new colony. Unlike the earlier military settlement, this expedition included women and children. White himself had more than a political interest in its success. His daughter, Eleanor, was traveling with him. So was Eleanor's husband, Ananias Dare. And Eleanor was pregnant. The colonists departed England in the spring of 1587 aboard a small fleet that included the flagship Lion. Accompanied by a flyboat and a pinnace, they crossed the Atlantic by a route that took them through the Caribbean before turning north toward the North American coast. Every mile increased the distance between them and English assistance. There were no radios, no engines, no emergency supply aircraft, no way to send a message and receive an answer days later. A colony could wait months or years for another English ship. The settlers therefore carried more than supplies. They carried tools, seeds, weapons, household possessions, and expectations of creating an entirely new community. John White carried responsibility for all of them, but command at sea was complicated. White was governor of the colonists. Navigation and shipboard decisions involved experienced maritime officers, including pilot Simon Fernandez. Fernandez was no inexperienced sailor. He had participated in Atlantic voyages and was connected to the earlier Roanoke expeditions. But relations between him and White became difficult. The plan was to stop near Roanoke and investigate what had happened to the 15 men left behind. Then the expedition would continue north toward Chesapeake Bay. That was the plan. But on July 22, 1587, when the expedition reached the Roanoke area, the plan began to collapse. Hashgar, Part 5, July 22, 1587. Stranded at Roanoke. John White and a small party went ashore searching for the men who had been left behind. They did not find a functioning English garrison. They found the remains of the previous settlement and evidence of death. The abandoned location was already a disturbing place to begin a family colony. White still intended to continue north toward Chesapeake Bay, but Simon Fernandez refused to take the settlers farther. The reason given was that the season was becoming too late. Historians have debated Fernandez's motives. Perhaps he genuinely considered further navigation too dangerous. Perhaps commercial and privateering interests influenced his decision. The surviving evidence does not allow us to know his private intentions. What matters is the result. The colonists were put ashore at Roanoke. Their temporary stopping point had suddenly become their home. They repaired the buildings left from the earlier colony. Wood had to be cut, shelters repaired, supplies organized, food secured, defenses considered. These people had crossed an ocean, intending to create a permanent community. Now they were doing so in a location with a recent history of conflict. The previous English settlement had already damaged relations with neighboring peoples. Some communities remembered how the earlier colonists had behaved. The families of 1587 therefore inherited consequences from decisions they had not personally made. They also arrived at a difficult environmental moment. Later scientific research based on tree rings found that the region suffered an extraordinary drought between 1587 and 1589. The very period during which the lost colony disappeared. Researchers described it as the most severe 3-year drought in their centuries-long reconstruction. Drought alone does not explain the lost colony, but it matters. A community dependent on crops, fresh water, trade, and indigenous food supplies would have faced tremendous pressure if harvests failed across the region, and scarcity would not have affected only the English. Neighboring indigenous communities also required food. Competition over limited supplies could make already damaged relationships even more fragile. The colonists had barely arrived. They were already in the wrong location. They had uncertain supplies. Their relationships with neighboring communities were dangerous. And one of the worst droughts reconstructed for the region was beginning around them. Then someone was killed. Part 6. The death of George Howe. Only days after arrival, colonist. George Howe went away from the settlement. He was killed. For the English colonists, the message was terrifying. They had women and children with them. They could not know whether another attack would follow. But understanding who had attacked Howe mattered enormously. The English believed members of a hostile indigenous community were responsible. They decided to retaliate. This was exactly the kind of moment in which accurate information was essential. Instead, the English made a disastrous mistake. They attacked a community associated with the Croatoan. People who had generally maintained better relations with them. A Croatoan man was killed. The colonists had attempted to punish their enemies. Instead, they injured a relationship they desperately needed. This episode is one reason the Roanoke story should not be told as a simple tale of Europeans against Native Americans. The political landscape was far more complicated. Manteo himself was Croatoan and remained closely connected to the English. Different indigenous communities had different relationships with the colonists. Some relationships were cooperative, others openly hostile, and English mistakes could transform one into the other. The settlers were now increasingly isolated. Without reliable cooperation from neighboring communities, their ability to survive the coming months became more uncertain. Manteo became even more important. He understood languages and cultures on both sides in ways few others could. For years he had moved between worlds. He had traveled across the Atlantic. He had seen England. He had worked with Raleigh's expeditions. And in August 1587, he took another extraordinary step. Manteo was baptized into the Christian faith by the English and was given an English title connected with Roanoke. but what he thought privately about everything happening around him is largely absent from the surviving English record. That absence is important. Much of what we know about Roanoke comes through English writers. The voices of the indigenous people whose homelands were being entered survive much less directly. History, therefore, gives us an incomplete picture. And from August 1587 onward, that picture becomes even more incomplete. Because within weeks, the person keeping the most important written record would sail away. Part 7. Manteo and the Fragile Alliance. If the colonists hoped to survive, people like Manteo were vital. He could interpret language. He understood local geography. He had relationships with the Croatoan. And after years of contact with the English, he understood far more about their behavior and intentions than most people in the region. But even Manteo could not erase the history of earlier violence. The English presence had changed local politics. To some communities, the newcomers were potential partners. To others, they were dangerous outsiders. And the settlers were not arriving in untouched wilderness. They had entered a populated cultural landscape with farms, villages, political leaders, trading relationships, rivalries, and histories of its own. The 1587 colonists needed food. They needed information. They needed security. And eventually, if they were going to establish a permanent settlement, they needed enough stability to survive without depending completely on supply ships from England. That stability never developed while White was there. The settlers had another problem. They were approaching autumn. Winter would follow, and they did not believe they had enough reliable supplies. Someone needed to return to England. Someone needed to explain how serious the situation had become. Someone needed to secure additional colonists, equipment, and food. The person they chose was their governor. John White did not immediately want to go. His family was on Roanoke. His daughter had crossed the Atlantic while pregnant, and events were moving toward a moment of personal joy in the middle of the growing crisis. A child was about to be born. Part 8. Virginia Dare, August 18th, 1587. On August 18th, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. Her name was Virginia Dare. She is remembered as the first English child born in the English colonial enterprise in North America. Her birth immediately became symbolic. Amid uncertainty, death, damaged alliances, and inadequate supplies, a baby represented something entirely different. Continuity, family, a future. The colony was not composed only of explorers planning to return to England after gathering information. Children were supposed to grow up here. Families were supposed to build permanent lives here. Virginia's grandfather was Governor John White. Her father, Ananias Dare, was also part of the colony. The surviving record tells us very little about Virginia herself. That is worth emphasizing. Centuries of stories, poems, legends, dramas, and speculation would eventually surround her. But historically, only a tiny number of facts about her short documented life are known. She was born on Roanoke Island on August 18th, 1587. She was baptized, and when John White sailed away later that month, he left her behind with her parents and the rest of the colony. Another baby was also born in the settlement around this period, to Marjorie and Dianese Harvey. Even the child's name and sex have not survived in the historical record. These details remind us of something often forgotten when Roanoke is described simply as a mystery. The lost colony was made of individuals, families, children, people whose names appear on a list and then disappear from history. For John White, that disappearance would eventually become intensely personal. But in August 1587, he still believed the separation would be temporary. The colonists wanted him to return to England for help. Eventually, he agreed. Before leaving, however, White and the settlers made plans for what should happen if conditions forced them to move. Those instructions would become the key to interpreting the most famous clue in the case. White-Chegg, Part 9. The Secret Signal. White knew the colonists might not remain at Roanoke. Indeed, relocation made sense. Roanoke had never been their intended permanent destination. According to the surviving accounts and later historical reconstruction, plans included moving some colonists inland. White instructed the settlers to leave information if they relocated before he returned. They were to carve the name of their destination. And there was another element. If they were forced away because of serious danger, they were to add a cross as a signal of distress. This arrangement changes the meaning of what White would discover in 1590. Croatoan was not necessarily a desperate final message. To White, it looked like the kind of message they had agreed to leave. No distress cross was visible. This is one reason historians cannot simply say the colony was mysteriously erased overnight. There is evidence that the settlers intentionally dismantled or removed parts of their settlement, and they left a destination clue. But that still leaves enormous questions. Did every colonist leave together? Or did they divide into groups as had been discussed? Did some travel south toward Croatoan? Did others move inland? How long did they survive? Did they eventually join indigenous communities? Were some killed later? Did disease or hunger reduce their numbers? The surviving 1587 record cannot answer those questions, because the man writing it was about to leave. On August 27th, 1587. Only a little more than a month after arriving at Roanoke and 9 days after Virginia's birth, John White boarded the returning ships. His daughter remained. His son-in-law remained. His newborn granddaughter remained. White intended to obtain supplies and return quickly. He could not have known that he was looking at them for the last documented time. Hashtag Part 10. John White sails away. August 27th, 1587. White's voyage back across the Atlantic was difficult. Storms battered the ship. Illness affected the crew. Supplies became dangerously low. Eventually, the vessel reached Ireland in October. White then made his way toward the people who could organize a relief expedition. He needed Sir Walter Raleigh. He needed ships. He needed supplies. He needed speed. Every month mattered. The colony had limited resources. Winter was coming. His own family was waiting. White expected to return, but history was moving against him. England and Spain were approaching a major confrontation. King Philip II of Spain prepared an enormous invasion force. The Spanish Armada was coming. For Queen Elizabeth's government, national survival took priority over an isolated settlement thousands of miles across the Atlantic. Ships that might have supplied Roanoke were suddenly required for England's defense. White did attempt to obtain a way back. In 1588, a relief effort involving smaller vessels was organized, but the voyage became entangled with privateering. The ships were damaged after encounters at sea and turned back. Roanoke remained beyond reach. For White, imagine what every delay meant. He had no way to know whether the settlers still had food, no way to know whether his daughter had survived the winter, no way to know whether Virginia was learning to walk, no way to send a message saying, "Help is delayed. Do not give up. We are still coming." There was only an ocean. And silence. Hashk, Part 11. The Spanish Armada, and 3 years of silence. 1588, 1590. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed against England. England ultimately survived the invasion attempt. But winning the conflict did not immediately solve John White's problem. Raleigh's priorities were changing. Privateering promised profit. Other ventures competed for money. Organizing another transatlantic supply mission was expensive. The Roanoke colonists became people without a voice in England. They could send no reports. Investors could not know whether they were alive, and White had increasingly little control over events. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, something happened. This is where responsible historical storytelling must change. Until White departed, we have documentary accounts. After that, direct English documentation from the colony stops. We cannot truthfully narrate exact conversations among the colonists. We cannot say that a particular family packed its belongings on a particular morning. We cannot show Virginia Dare growing older and claim we know where she lived. No surviving diary tells us. No confirmed letter from the colonists has been found. There is instead evidence from climate, archaeology, later reports, and White's eventual discoveries. One modern clue comes from trees. A scientific study using tree ring evidence reconstructed severe drought across the region from 1587 through 1589. The researchers concluded that this was the most extreme 3-year drought in an approximately 800-year reconstruction. Think about what drought meant in a 16th century coastal colony. Reduced harvests, pressure on freshwater, less surplus food available for trade, greater pressure not just on the English, but on neighboring indigenous communities. It would have made cooperation more valuable and competition more dangerous. This does not prove that drought destroyed Roanoke, but it provides an environmental background that White could not have understood while waiting in England. The colonists probably had to make choices. Stay on an island where relationships were unstable and supplies were uncertain. Move inland as previously planned. Seek help from friendly indigenous communities. Or perhaps divide. Some evidence today makes that final possibility especially interesting. But in 1590, John White knew none of it. He knew only that 3 years had passed. Finally, he found a ship. Hashtag Part 12. The Return Voyage. March-August 1590. In March 1590, John White finally sailed west again. But this was not a dedicated rescue fleet under his command. He had secured passage with privateers. That distinction mattered. Their priorities did not completely match his. White wanted one thing: Roanoke. The crews had other opportunities in the Atlantic and Caribbean. The expedition, therefore, took far longer than a direct relief voyage might have. Month after month passed. 3 years earlier, White had sailed away, believing he would return soon. Now his granddaughter would be almost 3 years old, if she was alive. By August, the ships reached the Outer Banks. Even then, danger continued. The waters around the barrier islands could be treacherous. Weather changed rapidly. Shoals, currents, and storms made landings hazardous. Men were lost during the attempt to reach Roanoke. On August 17th, White and the sailors approached the island. They saw signs that initially gave them hope. Smoke had been observed in the area during their approach. The men even used sound as they came near the shore, hoping any English settlers might hear them. But no familiar voice answered. Darkness and dangerous conditions delayed their landing. White spent another night separated from the place he had struggled 3 years to reach. Then morning came. August 18th, 1590. Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. White went ashore. Part 13. CRO. The landing party moved through terrain White remembered, but the colony did not look as he had left it. Then they saw the first message. Carved into a tree were 3 Roman letters. CRO. White immediately connected the letters to the arrangement made with the colonists. The message appeared to begin the name of a location. They continued. The settlement itself had changed dramatically. The houses had not simply been burned in a sudden attack. Instead, structures appeared to have been deliberately taken down. A wooden palisade had been constructed, and on one of its posts was the complete word Croatoan. There was no agreed distress cross. To a modern audience, trained by centuries of mystery stories, the word may sound sinister. To White, it initially offered hope. He knew exactly what Croatoan meant. It pointed toward people and a place south of Roanoke. Manteo came from the Croatoan community. White therefore believed the colonists could have moved there, and the physical condition of the settlement appeared consistent with an organized departure. Useful materials had apparently been removed rather than simply abandoned. The colonists had not vanished like people in a supernatural story. They had gone somewhere. That distinction is essential. The mystery is not whether human beings literally disappeared into thin air. The mystery is where they went afterward, and what eventually happened to them. White searched further. He discovered that belongings he had left behind had been disturbed and damaged. Books and maps suffered from exposure. Armor had rusted. But nothing he discovered told him where his daughter was. There was only that word, Croatoan. White now needed to do the obvious thing. Sail south. Reach Croatoan. Ask questions. Search for his family. Perhaps, after 3 years, he was only a few miles from the answer. And then the sea intervened again. Part 14. The search that never happened. White wanted the ships to investigate Croatoan, but conditions were deteriorating. Bad weather threatened the expedition. The vessels had already lost anchors. Continuing the search became increasingly dangerous. Attempts to reach the Croatoan location did not succeed. Eventually, the ships were forced away. John White left the coast. He had traveled across the Atlantic after waiting almost 3 years. He had reached the abandoned settlement. He had found a message that seemed to tell him where the colonists had gone. But he never reached the place named in that message. That may be the most frustrating fact in the entire story. Roanoke's greatest mystery exists partly because the investigation stopped at the moment when its best clue was discovered. White returned to England. His daughter Eleanor was never found. Ananias Dare was never found. Virginia Dare was never found. The other colonists were never conclusively identified. White would never see Roanoke again. The lost colony entered history, but the disappearance produced theories almost immediately, and over 4 centuries later, researchers are still asking which theory best fits the evidence. Was Croatoan the answer? Possibly. But perhaps not the entire answer. Hashtag Part 15. Where did everyone go? Evidence, theories, and the mystery today. There are several major explanations for what became of the Roanoke colonists. We must separate what is plausible from what is proven. Theory 1. They moved to Croatoan. This is perhaps the most straightforward interpretation. The colonists carved Croatoan at Roanoke. They did not add the distress symbol agreed upon with White. Manteo had strong connections with the Croatoan people, and White himself believed his settlers had gone there. Modern researchers have recovered European objects dating to the general Roanoke period on Hatteras Island. These discoveries make contact between indigenous people and Elizabethan English material culture especially interesting. But artifacts alone do not prove that the entire lost colony relocated there. Objects can move through trade, and no graveyard, settlement, or collection of remains has been conclusively identified as those of White's colonists. So the Croatoan explanation is compelling, but not proven. Theory 2. Some colonists moved inland. White and the settlers had discussed movement away from Roanoke. Modern archaeological investigation in the western Albemarle Sound region has recovered Elizabethan period European artifacts at a location researchers call Site X. The First Colony Foundation argues that some of the material could reflect the presence of Roanoke colonists. Importantly, even these researchers do not claim Site X proves that the entire colony moved there. It could represent a smaller group. That raises another possibility. Theory 3. The colony split up. Perhaps there was never one destination. Imagine the practical problem. More than 100 people were difficult to feed. A drought was affecting the region. Roanoke was insecure. Dividing into smaller groups could have made survival easier. Some may have moved toward Croatoan. Others may have moved inland. Over time, they could have integrated into different indigenous communities. If that happened, there would be no single archaeological site containing the lost colony. There would be several stories. Theory 4. Violence. Later reports connected with the Jamestown era claimed that some Roanoke survivors had been killed. But those accounts were recorded years after the disappearance and must be treated cautiously. Violence certainly occurred in the region during the Roanoke period. George Howe had been killed. Earlier English indigenous conflicts had already occurred, so violence cannot be ruled out. But there is no definitive evidence demonstrating that all of White's colonists were massacred. The condition of the abandoned settlement in 1590 did not suggest that everyone had died there in a single catastrophic attack. Theory 5. Hunger, disease, and environmental pressure. The drought from 1587 to 1589 provides strong scientific evidence of extremely difficult environmental conditions. Food shortages could have encouraged migration. Malnutrition could have increased vulnerability to disease. Scarcity could also have intensified conflict. But once again, drought is a condition, not a complete solution to the mystery. It may explain why colonists moved without telling us where they eventually died or lived. What about Virginia Dare? This is perhaps the question that has fascinated people most. Did Virginia survive childhood? Did she grow up among the Croatoan? Did she move inland with her parents? Did she die during the colony's early struggle? We do not know. No reliable historical document records her life after John White left Roanoke on August 27, 1587. Everything more specific must therefore be labeled legend or speculation. And perhaps that is where the real power of Roanoke lies. The mystery is not that history left us with nothing. History left us with just enough. A settlement constructed and then dismantled. An agreed signaling system. A devastating drought. Complicated relationships with indigenous communities. Archaeological traces in more than one possible direction. A governor separated from his family by war. And a single word cut into wood. Croatoan. Maybe the settlers never considered themselves lost. Maybe they knew exactly where they were going. Maybe some reached Croatoan and found protection. Maybe others traveled inland. Perhaps English identities slowly blended into indigenous communities until later English explorers no longer recognized the descendants they were searching for. Or perhaps disease, hunger, and violence eventually claimed many of them. 4 centuries later, archaeology continues searching for evidence. But historians have not found enough to write the final chapter. So when we ask, where did everyone go? The most accurate answer remains, we do not know exactly. But they probably did not simply disappear. The clues suggest movement, adaptation, survival attempts, perhaps separation, and possibly assimilation. On August 18, 1590, John White stood inside an empty settlement, looking at the word his colonists had left behind. For him, Croatoan was a direction. For history, it became a mystery. And somewhere, beneath the soil of coastal North Carolina, or within evidence not yet recognized, the rest of the story may still be waiting. End. Closing narration for YouTube. More than 400 years later, the Lost Colony of Roanoke remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries of early English America. But the truth is more fascinating than the legends. These were real people living through colonization, drought, conflict, political uncertainty, family separation, and an unforgiving Atlantic world. Their final destination remains uncertain. And until new evidence changes what historians know, Croatoan remains the strongest message they left behind. If you enjoyed this evidence-based journey into America's past, subscribe for the next true historical mystery. Because sometimes the greatest stories in history are not the ones with perfect endings. They are the ones still waiting to be solved. 4. Historical accuracy. /YouTube production rules. For the finished video. Present. July 22nd, 1587. as the arrival at Roanoke and August 18th, 1590. As White's rediscovery of the abandoned settlement. Present. August 18th, 1587. As Virginia Dare's birth. Present. August 27th, 1587. As White's departure. Never show the colonists being massacred and narrate it as historical fact. Never claim Virginia Dare definitely became part of an indigenous community. Never claim the colony was destroyed by drought alone. Never claim archaeological artifacts have conclusively solved Roanoke. When showing hypothetical survival scenes, add historical reconstruction or possible scenario. On screen. Treat the Croatoan, Roanoke, Secatan, and other indigenous communities as distinct peoples where the evidence supports that distinction. Do not portray all native peoples as a single enemy group. Violence can be shown cinematically without graphic gore. Avoid invented quotations attributed to John White, Virginia Dare, Manteo, Raleigh, or indigenous leaders. Genuine historical quotations should be taken from documented sources. For maximum audience retention, end parts 1, 5, 9, 12, and 14 with a question or unresolved discovery, rather than repeating the same "they disappeared" hook. Use maps whenever geographic movement becomes important, so viewers understand. Roanoke, Croatoan, Hatteras, Inland, Albemarle, England. This. Keep the ending unresolved. The historically responsible conclusion is that the ultimate fate of the full colony remains uncertain. B. Suggested 60-minute timing. 000 Shay. Part 1. The Empty Colony. 0408. Part 2. England Wants an Empire. 112. Part 3. The Colony Before the Lost Colony. 12:16 o'clock. Part 4. Families Cross the Atlantic. 16 Hapron Yatwentiub. Part 5. Stranded at Roanoke. 20 o'clock to 24 o'clock. Part 6. George Howe is killed. 24 o'clock, 28 o'clock. Part 7. Manteo and the Alliance. 28 to 32. Part 8. Virginia Dare. 32 to 36. Part 9. The Secret Signal. 36 to 40 o'clock. Part 10. White Sails Away. 40 o'clock to 44. Part 11. Armada and Silence. 44 o'clock, 48:04. Part 12. The Return Voyage. 48 to C52. Part 13. Croatoan. 52:56. Part 14. The Search That Never Happened. 56:60 afloat. Part 15. The Evidence and Major Theories.